Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the vocabulary of weaving in Japhug, and about historical linguistics, and also some things related to how the system of orientation is used to express the activity of weaving in this language. So, so some of this work, some of the things I'm going to talk today are partially mentioned in a grammar I published 1 year ago. So let me just put a link here in the chat. So, but not. I'll add a few things that are not in there, and also it's based on a series of videos I made in 2014, and one of them is available online with a transcription. So you can click on the link and listen to it after the presentation, so that you have an idea, a more precise idea of this. So I'm going to make this presentation also in for my fellow colleagues who are doing language documentation in Rgyalrong areas and elsewhere, to also in the hope that some of you will do similar research and find language teachers who are able to explain the activity of weaving. I think that it's quite important, not just for the documentation of the language, but also to understand the larger cultural context of weaving in a society. And also it has incidence on the study of, I would say, interdisciplinary research, combining linguistics on the one hand and other fields, in particular archaeology on the other hand. So I'm going to talk about Yarongic languages. So one Rgyalrongic language, Japhug, which is here spoken. This is Barkham, spoken. It's a region in Sichuan. Most of you are already familiar, but some who are present today may not know this area well. So it's a Markham. It's a county in western Sichuan. Yarongic languages are represented on this map in purple. Yeah, so most of them are located in western Sichuan here. Some of them are also in Chamdo, so the Smartskat language that were recently discovered. Recently brought to the attention of linguists, and Liang, who is among us today, is now doing field work on one of them. And this one is Tangut, language attested, the oldest, the ancient language in a subgroup, a Tangut that is attested from the 11th century onwards. And I think that in a joint work by Yunfan and myself and a few other colleagues, we showed, I think, that it really is a sub-branch of the Rgyalrongic subgroup. Now, today we've heard about Karsting, so one of the variety of Setu, and about Krostjap. So here we have areas where various varieties of Krostjap are spoken. And Japhug is the target language of this talk. Yeah. Now, in the recording I sent you, so this is Tenzin, my main language teacher, presenting explaining how she makes looms. She makes a colored bells. So it's called huatai in Chinese. Yeah? And so she demonstrates how to make them using this loom. So it's a type of loom that's called body tension backstrap loom. Yeah. So it doesn't have a huge frame, unlike more complex looms that you may have seen with a complete frame in wood. Here you just have the threads. So these threads, the warp, the threads that are tied onto the back of the weaver on the one hand, and tied to some other place on the other end. So actually they are tied next to the window. She just improvised this weaving place in her apartment. What is interesting is that this is an area of the vocabulary where we have particularly detailed terminology, some of which is of local origin and some of which is borrowed. That's something we're going to investigate. But before I start, just let me discuss today's talk. So I'm going to present the local vocabulary in Japhug and other Rgyalrongic variety, and attempt to identify the part of the vocabulary that's native, and that's the one that's borrowed from Tibetan. So that's quite important because, so that's the kind of thing linguists can tell, whether a word is inherited from a common ancestor of subgroup, or whether it was borrowed from some other language, literal language, and whether it can be reconstructed and how old the word is within the language. So now, this is important because if we want to reconstruct the history of the weaving technique, one way we can do it is by studying the antiquity of the words themselves in the vocabulary, and compare it with the insight we can get from the material artifacts themselves and the techniques themselves. Yeah. And I think that there is much room for further research in this area. And finally, I'm going to discuss about, as I said, the orientation system. Okay. So first of all, it's important to point out that part of the weaving vocabulary in Japhug and other Rgyalrongic languages is actually very ancient and borrowed, not borrowed, but inherited from Proto-Sino-Tibetan, the common ancestor of Yarongi and Chinese. So we have, for instance, Japhug kata, the verb to weave, and kopro, the word to spin. So, for instance, we know that this O origins from ang, and it just happens that it corresponds well to the equivalent words in Tibetan and in Chinese. So this, I'm not going to go too much into detail in terms of the sound correspondences, but there is a good fit in the sound correspondences of these words. In Japhug, we have verbs. Kata and kopro are verbs. In Chinese, they are verbs too. In Tibetan, this is a verb and this is a noun, spindle. But in any case, there is little doubt that these words are inherited. So this is quite important. It means that part of this vocabulary is much older than the Rgyalrongic languages themselves. So how old actually? Yeah, well, there is the earliest spindles discovered in China. So we have the verb to spin. The verb for loom and spindle are derived from these verbs. So here the nouns are not so important. It's better to focus on the verbs themselves because the nouns for loom and spindle are derived. And actually the nouns across the family don't have good correspondence. They tend to be innovated in each subgroup, but the verbs are quite old. Now, this can be compared with some of the material culture actually, because so the spindles actually are well preserved in the archaeological record. And so in former work, we've proposed, Yunfan and I have participated in it, that the origin of the Sino-Tibetan family, there is evidence that it comes from the mid and up Yellow River in the early Neolithic, so around 7,000 years BP, so 5,000 years BC, corresponding to possibly these cultures. So this is the early archaeological evidence for Neolithic cultures that have either a millet farming or rice farming. So millet farming culture are indicated in purple, and mainly rice farming culture are indicated in yellow. A few cultures have both, like Holy, for instance, has little rice. And the idea proposed in articles and also supported by a lot of scholars is that the origin of the Sino-Tibetan family is probably to be looked for in the Yellow River Basin. What's interesting in regard with the weaving techniques is that so in a Tshechan culture and also Pelican, we have traces of spindles. Not only in these cultures, they are actually, these are also found in the culture of the Yangtze River. In any case, in a Yellow River basin, the early Neolithic culture already had spindles and also possibly evidence of shuttles, made of bone. So, of course, textiles are poorly preserved in general. So we don't have a lot of ancient textiles dating from the early Neolithic in this part of the world. But I would say that the linguistic evidence and the archaeological evidence have a good fit here. So we can't reconstruct a lot, but there is definitely evidence that some of the weaving techniques that are found in the Sino-Tibetan speaking areas may be inheritance from the early Neolithic, rather than, for instance, borrowing from other parts of the world. Although this is something that needs to be determined, but there is this potential. So there is also another root that's not found in Chinese, but found, for instance, in Pulong, a word for weave baskets. So not really weave clothes, but weave baskets, which involves a slightly different process. But we use the same word in English, although other languages may not. So for instance, in Chinese, we also have a different verb, bian, as opposed to zhi. Now, apart from these verbs, which are much older than Yarongi, what exactly, which kind of vocabulary do we have? Well, there is, of course, the important elements of the loom are the threads themselves, the warp and the weft. So, jingxian and weixian in Chinese. So, the warp here are the colored threads, the ones that are tied between the weaver and the other end. There are several colors of warp here. And the weft is this white thread that is inserted between them. So here, what's interesting is that, so if we look at Tibetan Chinese, we see that the terms are completely unrelated. And actually, they are not very specific in Tibetan. These words have many other meanings. If we compare now Japhug below, and cross-jab, we also see that there's no clear correspondence between them. However, now if you compare the ancient language Tangut with cross-jab, the sound correspondences we observe here, which are not trivial, are actually quite correct. So for the first word, this V can correspond to a P, the U can correspond to this vowel, and the dot under the U can correspond to the pre-initial L. For this verb, for this word, it's the same. The U can correspond to O, the pre-initial R can correspond to this, what's transcribed as an R in this transcription. And the K can correspond to this K. It fits also with Conscience article about uvulas and velas in Tangut, since here we have yod that is expected if we have a vela here, rather than a uvula. So from the point of view of some correspondences, the cross-jab and a Tangut form are quite compatible. So here I have to specify that if you look at these characters in Tangut dictionaries, you will they don't gloss them as weft and wall. I think they give the same gloss for both of them. But that's probably because we don't have many textual examples of these characters, and their exact meaning in the Tangut text is not well known. And actually, by comparison with cross-jab, it's possible that we can recover the meaning of the Tangut words. So this is something that needs to be confirmed by more work on the Tangut texts, but I haven't identified yet examples of these words in texts other than the dictionaries. Yeah. So in the dictionaries, we know that they have to do with weaving, but the exact meaning is not is ambiguous, I would say. But in any case, I think that we have good evidence that these two terms are native in cross-jab and Tangut and go back at least to their common ancestors, so Proto-West Yarongi. In Japhug, we have another word, an interesting word, ʔśkār, which refers to this. The place where the weft and the warp crosses. So actually in English, I learned from Chris Buckley's work, this a space between the warp and the weft is called a shed. I'm not sure which term we could use in English for the crossing place, but in any case, there is a special word for it in Japhug. I'm not aware of any special word in any other Rgyalrongic language, but I urge my fellow field workers to identify the words, either for the space between this space between the warp and the weft, and for the crossing part between them. So these pictures are taken from the video from which you can see the link of which I sent in the beginning of the presentation. So these terms are definitely native. They are not borrowed, but Japhug and cross-jab don't have cognate forms, and the further etymologies remain unknown to me. But hopefully, when equivalent studies have been done on other varieties of Yarongi, we may have a better understanding of the history of these words. Now, but at least they are not obviously derived from known verbs. So they all may be potentially ancient. Now, apart from these, we have a lot of implements, and some of them are of Tibetan origin. So the English terminology here is based on the book by Budo and Buckley on the roots of Asian weaving, which is focused on the weaving of Miao and Kra-Dai-speaking people mainly, not exclusively, mainly, but provides a very detailed lexicon of terminological equivalence between Chinese and Tibet and English, and provide the terms in many languages, in Mongic and Kra-Dai languages. So it's a very useful book to do fieldwork, also in Tibetan areas, although the kind of looms we have in Tibetic, in Rgyalrongic areas may be very different. And what we see here is that, so there's I put the Japhug form instead of Tibetan here. A lot of the terms we have here are actually Tibetan words. Yeah, so it's quite clear for all these. Yeah, and I'll show the implements and what they are like. The last ones, the ones, so snas in Tibetan, ne, and shnat in Japhug, is probably not a boring, but rather a cognate, yeah, because the forms do not present the sound correspondences that we usually find in loan words. And it refers to something that we'll see in pictures. It's useless for me to go through these terms now without the pictures. So first of all, let's have a look at this. So it's called chz in Japhug. This is this rod element that's used in a video. If you have a look at the video later, you will see how it's used to clamp the one end of the warp threads so as to and then to tie it onto the waist of the weaver. Yeah? So it's used to maintain the tension on the warp threads. Yeah. So this choose the word. It looks like a Tibetan word, but I haven't yet identified which word. Yeah? But I suspect that this z comes from a bu suffix preceded by an s. So I'm still looking for the word, and I hope I'll find it someday. But it's certainly not a local Rgyalrongic word. Yeah, it doesn't look like it. Yeah, so we have this z final element, for instance, umbrez, so the result, which is from Tibetan bras bu. So the sound from part of your sound correspondence, this z is definitely from z bu. I think that it's quite clear. So this is called cloth beam in English. Now, another part of the loom is these small plank-like things called tasha that are used to, they are moved up and down and are used to select the different types of, and keep separate the different types of warp thread, because we have several colors of warp threads that are used to make the patterns in a cloth as it is woven. Yeah. So as you see, the thread is woven first from the lower end, yeah, from the waist of the weaver upwards. Yeah. So you have woven thread here, and it's rolled on then on the cloth beam. So this tasha, the ta element, is actually the cognate of the verb we have here. This verb, weave, in Tibetan. This ta form is another morphological alternate related to the verb root that we have over there. Yeah? And sha would mean something like flesh or meat, but I'm not too sure why we have this form here. But this word tak sha you can find it in the dictionary in Tibetan. The next word that we can identify is the weft beta. So this thing here, I don't know, yeah, we can't see it well, but in the video you see it's a wooden implement with a blade. It has a blade that has not been sharpened, of course, and it's used to beat the weft, so this white thread, so that it's the weft and the warp are tied together. Yeah. Before so this implement, as you can see, is called tamu, and more or less cognate with the Tibetan form takma. Probably the form from which tamu comes from is raza and takmu, with the mu suffix in the ma suffix. It wouldn't be very surprising. So, but in the dictionary, if you find takma, I wouldn't be surprised if takmo would appear in some text, but I just didn't identify it. So all of these are implements are Tibetan words. So actually, these were self-made. So Tsinzen's husband made this pakmo for her. So it's locally made. And then we have this word zgrl. Zgrl refers to what? Refers to this rod, yeah? They're also used to control the degree of tension in a warp thread, yeah, at the other extremity from the weaver. Yeah? And the small one here is called zgrl, the little zgrl, with a diminutive suffix. So all of these are borrowed from Tibetan. So we see most of the implements used to make the class are Tibetan loanwords, as opposed to the verbs that are local and the names of the thread themselves that are also have inherited words. And then we have the last term, snas in Tibetan, or ne, if you pronounce it in Hausa, and snat. So this one refers to what? Refers to the hedo. These things, these threads with different colors, and they are connected with a stick. So what's their use? Their use is to select one type of the different type of warp threads that you are choosing. You pull them up, and you select a different layer of warp threads. So the term in English is hedo for that. Surprisingly, this word is found everywhere in Sino Tibetan, so it's quite old. We have cognates in Tangut, in Tibetan, not just but in these, but also in Burmese, in Toulon, and in Jingpo. So actually, apart from Chinese, it's almost a Proto-Sino Tibetan word. So that confirms the idea that some relatively elaborate kind of loom technology did exist very, very early in mid or even early Neolithic. Of course, we wouldn't expect these to be well preserved archaeologically, but the linguistic evidence is quite, I think, quite clear. And I don't think these words are likely to have been borrowed because the form do not match what we would expect of borrowings from Burmese into Toulon and Jingpo. And it's also a word that's probably cognate in Tangut, and it's a perfect cognate. This cognate actually was discovered by Gongxun a few years ago. And here, again, the gloss that's given in the dictionaries is quite misleading. Yeah, I think it's also given, it's also translated as warp or weft thread in the dictionary, but it's quite misleading. It's just because the dictionary makers haven't looked into detail at the etymology of these words, and we haven't a text that attests their use. You know, so it's a case where comparative linguistics can help to correctly identify the meaning of words in Congo too. So this is what I wanted to say about the etymology of the weaving vocabulary. So as we can see, we can identify the etymology of most of these words, apart from țħr, and we can also distinguish well what is inherited from what is borrowed. Yeah. So what is borrowed has to do with the wooden implements that are used to make these tools that are used to make the additional patterns in the cloth. And these words, the history of these words deserves to be better known. And I would be interested also to see if any Rgyalrongic language has non-borrowed words to designate these implements. That would also be something quite interesting. So some of you today are still on the field. I'm thinking of, in particular, of Traholian and also of Yujing, who are respectively in Chamdo and in Rnawa areas. And so if you have time to find someone who can weave cloths and show you how to do it and explain at the same time, and you have the opportunity of making videos of it, I think it would be quite an important contribution to document how the weaving process takes place and which terms are used for each of these tools. Now, another interesting thing from a really purely linguistic point of view, it's not just the etymology of the words themselves, but the grammar that goes with it. Now, we have an interesting metaphor in the weaving process. Well, the warp threads, the axis of the warp threads is compared to the upstream downstream axis. Now we know that in Yarongi languages, and Shuya is going to talk about this more detail tomorrow, we have a tri-dimensional axis system. So many of us have written about it. Yujing, who is present today, also has an important article on this. So one of the axes is upstream, downstream. Another axis, probably east-west. Some have interpreted it as a mountain versus river axis. So Yujing has written about this particular issue. And the third one is more straightforward, up-down. And in fact, all the three axes play a role in a description of the weaving process. Now, the most conspicuous axis is the upstream, downstream axis. Downstream in this system represents the side where of the weaver. Upstream is the side away from the weaver. Yeah. So here next to the window, where the other place where the warp threads have been tied down. Yeah. So this is called alo in Japhug and ati, loti. So let's see an example sentence taken from this the recording you can later listen to. You have the whole transcription sentence by sentence, so it should be easy to find. So the warp, this thread, whose body goes upstream, so actually is oriented towards the opposite direction of the weaver is called the warp. And here I use the color, this color code, to indicate the morpheme in the original that correspond to this upstream orientation. Now we have downstream. So here the color code, I use blue to indicate the upstream downstream axis. So this refers to the action here. Let me see. Another. Oh yeah, I don't have it. I don't have a picture of this action. Thermonulect. So nulet here. So using the orientation westwards means when you take this thermo, this wave beta, you put the weft beta between the warp threads. This is called nulet. Why? Because it is the orientation perpendicular to the upstream downstream axis. You see? So the left-right of the weaver is compared to the east-west orientation, regardless of where he actually is oriented himself or herself. Yeah. Regardless whether it's the geographical orientation is north-south or whatever, the east-west orientation will be used to express simply the axis that is perpendicular to the upstream-downstream axis. Yeah? So logically, you use nulet to indicate this the motion of the weft beta between the threads, and so perpendicular to the to the threads, and so it's basically the left-right orientation of the weaver. Yeah? And then you have this expression chuta. So that's quite interesting because the verb kata, so this cognate of Chinese fangzhi in the zhi, it can be used with two orientations. It can be used with the orientation upstream and the orientation downstream, and it has a different meaning in Japan. When it's used with downstream, it actually refers to the motion downwards when you take the weft beta and beat the weft tight. Yeah? Because the weft is taken and you move it towards yourself. So the motion takes place downstream. It's also used with upstream, but then what's the meaning? When you say luta, it means that the cloth is progressively being made, and it goes upwards on the opposite direction. Because as you pass the weft and you beat it, and you create cloth, it grows towards the opposite direction of the weaver. So this is upstream. So these are things that are difficult to convey precisely in a dictionary. Yeah? So here, chuta means to press down, weave down, to express it literally. And when you create cloth, by the weaving process, you weave upward, upstream. And then in the same passage, just before you say, ki aspa ki chisakshim. So what it means is that hamu causes, sakshin is the causative of go actually, causes the asqar. So we said before, space, the place where the weft and the warp crosses. We bring it down and press it And here it says mtʰŭxtʃĥr. So again, we have this meaning downstream to express the meaning that this intersection is moved toward the body of the weaver. So this is the upstream, downstream axis. So in fact, in the Japhug grammar, I already mentioned this phenomenon that we have an upstream, downstream orientation corresponding to the direction of the warp. But in fact, we have all four orientation used when we describe the weaving process. The eastward-westward orientation represents the orientation of weft. That goes perpendicular to the wall. And up and down can be also used. So I haven't represented it because it would be difficult to see. So in blue, you have upstream, downstream. In red, you have eastward, westward. You have to understand it as perpendicular to the upstream, downstream orientation. And then you have a fourth orientation that's also perpendicular to them, although it would be slightly slanted here because the upstream, downstream orientation is slanted here. It is the different layers of wool. Because since you have different colors, you have different layers corresponding to, you have the red wool and the green wool. And you have this, you can use the up and down orientation to refer to these different layers. When you, for instance, you change color for a particular, to get a particular pattern. So this illustrates one of the extended use of the tridimensional system that is so grammaticalized in a verbal system and in a whole grammatical system of Yarongi languages. Now, one of the reasons I'm making this presentation is that I hope to have that fellow linguists and fieldworkers and speakers will help in documenting this aspect of the language and answer the different questions. So, is the upstream, downstream, the dimensional system in other Rgyalrongic languages used in the same way to express the different aspects of weaving? And do we find cognate words other than the ones I've shown here? Do we find different words, native words perhaps, for these different implements? Or do we find different Tibetan loans? What's the age of these different words? And what's the age also of this use of the tridimensional system? And these are all questions that I can't answer now, but I hope that this presentation will motivate you to do further research. So with this, I conclude, and I hope that it was interesting to you.